2030s are going to be the great decade of retirement. By the time we hit the 2040s, it's going to almost become like a great extinction event. But unlike many other projections about what our future is going to look like, these ones you can actually mark on your calendar because the decisions have all already been made.
What do you see ahead for population in the U.S. if our immigration slows down?
Well, if American immigration slows down, it's going to be a problem for the United States because as we've seen in the most recent data that's come out of the CDC, there was a fairly significant decline in America's birth rate down to 1.6, which is the lowest in a century over the space of the pandemic. So if you can't somehow replace those babies that weren't born, you're going to have to find a way to compensate somehow. So given that the trend in terms of birth rates is generally down as opposed to up, the only way that you can really compensate for that is two things. Whether, first of all, people need to live longer. We've also seen that there's been a decline in American longevity, or you have to find new people to move to the United States to replace those babies that were previously born. So for the U.S. population to continue to grow through this century, immigration is going to be essential.
If it doesn't, what are the implications of a depopulation?
Well, the first part would be something that people would probably see as a good thing, which is that declining populations, if you accept the view that humanity is responsible for climate change or environmental degradation in general, then you probably think that smaller is a better number. But when you think about all the economic aspects of this, it's a problem because our economy is driven by the consumption of consumers. And if you have a smaller number of consumers, and particularly the population of those consumers is much older, they'll just consume less of the products and services that we provide in any economy. So economic growth is really going to be challenged. So it's not just that the population gets smaller, it's that the structure changes. Normally we talk about populations as being in a pyramid, the population pyramid, where you have a lot of kids being born and then we all drop off the pyramid as it gets tighter and tighter and narrower as we move up the pyramid, because we all do eventually leave the pyramid. But the problem is right now what we're starting to do is flip the pyramid, where there's a lot fewer kids being born and a lot more older people that are part of our population. That type of a population, from an economic perspective, from a consumption perspective, is problematic.
Mm-hmm. And there does seem to be, at the same time, this narrative that it's better, or that we should have fewer people, or that the world is too populated. What do you think is the source of that narrative?
Well, I think that it's been a long time that this has been in place. I mean, the person who gives, some initial credit for coming up with this idea was Malthus. When he wrote his treatise on population growth, and his view was that what would happen is that humanity would continue to outstrip its ability to actually feed itself, and that somehow we needed to control the population. And this has been a popular trope in culture for a very long time. I mean, if you look at the Guardians of the Galaxy movie a little while ago, why did Thanos need to attack the universe as he did? Well, because he needed to cut the population in half because we were outliving our resources. So it's a very popular trope. This idea that the world is overrun by people is something that has been, I think, part of popular culture. Economic analysis, political analysis, social analysis for a long time. Now, that it doesn't actually fit the narrative, that the data don't actually fit the narrative doesn't seem to matter. It's really more the narrative that seems to have a life.
Mm-hmm. So if a depopulation is happening, what are the biggest factors that you're noticing to contribute to that?
Well, it depends on where you go. So depopulation is not happening everywhere. It's probably happening, depending on the estimates that are coming out these days, in upwards 40 to 60 countries, where they're actually experiencing a decline in population every year. But it's not just that the population is declining, it's also rapidly aging during that period too. So like a population like Japan loses about 500,000 people a year today, and its median age is soon going to be over, pushing into 50. It's in the high 40s now. And that's a population that will never be able to replace itself through natural means. Why? Because the median age of the population is too high. The biology of reproduction is really working against them. So it's not just that you reach a point where the population starts to decline, is that the decline accelerates because the population ages over time, and as the population gets older, its ability to reproduce itself declines.
Mm-hmm. And if this is happening in so many places around the world, what could have been done to see this in advance? Is there something that could have prevented this?
Well, I don't know it's so much a prevention because, as I said before, some people would see this as a good thing. Other people would see it as a bad thing. As we write in Empty Planet, John and I came up with what our conclusion was about it, which is it's not that it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a big thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that the reason that people have ignored it for so long is because it seemed like it was going to be a long time off. Mm-hmm. But what's happened is that fertility rates have collapsed so rapidly as we've moved into this millennium that all of those dates that seem far off are now much closer.
Yeah, and in your book too, you picked up on trends in projections from the UN and how the UN seemed to project much higher numbers than what you were picking up on. What was the discrepancy there?
Well, the UN has a pretty conservative model for estimating population growth and fertility rates. And basically, population is determined by three things they tell us. It's mobility of the population, fertility of the population, and death rates. So it's a pretty conservative model. What was missing is what we wrote about in Empty Planet, which is basically culture. Mm-hmm. And that's what's really changing rapidly here. And it's the idea that people have embraced that fewer children in their lives is a better thing. So if you're not producing kids to satisfy your religion, satisfy the patriarchy, satisfy your family, pressure from your mothers and fathers and your aunts and your uncles and others, mm-hmm. If you're basically having children as a part of life's experience, you've pretty much been fulfilled and lived life's experience after one or two. And that's really what's happening right now, is that the culture around fertility in many countries is changing, and it's becoming a fairly universal idea.
Yeah, it was really surprising to me as I was reading your book, all the different factors that would come up, because the book is presented as a series of expeditions into different nations, meeting people there, doing real interviews on the ground. And you're coming up with things like, I believe it was in Brazil, that there's a trend towards sterilization, which never would have crossed my mind before. What surprised you in that exploration?
What surprised me the most, Brendan, was that everybody ends up in the same place, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that Anna Karenina, quote, was it happy families are all happy in the same way, but unhappy families are unhappy all in their own way, or words to that effect. But that's what's happened around the culture argument. It's if you go to Africa, it's one set of reasons, and we went to Kenya in the book, one set of stars coming together in a certain constellation. It's somewhat different in China, somewhat different in India, somewhat different in Brazil, somewhat different in America, somewhat different here where I am today in Canada, somewhat different in Brussels. Where else did we go? I mean, we went to a lot of places, Seoul, Korea. Mm-hmm. But all of these things add up in different ways. They come at it in different ways, but the outcome is the same. It's really about the way that women have decided to live different lives, and how when they gain control over their fertility, their desire is to reduce it. And that's in order to have a different kind of life than their mother or their grandmothers had. But the way that they get there is different in different places.
Mm-hmm. What did you see in terms of maybe places where the trend is turning the other way, where maybe there's a trend up? And you talked about this in the book too. There were places where people maybe would have assumed that the trend was up, but it wasn't. What did you find?
Well, there are some places in the world that the trend has gone up. So, for example, I was at a thing for the European Commission back in June, and, Finland's increased its birth rate just a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of Nordic countries there's a couple of other places in the world that probably have that I may or may not be aware of. I haven't run into the data yet. But the point is that none of them are above replacement rate. So for your listeners, I mean, replacement rate is basically a fertility rate in a country of 2.1. And that's enough to replace the number of people who are going to be dying every year. So enough to replace you and your partner, and a little bit extra for those who don't have children, for children who don't live to maturity and are able to have families on their own. So none of those countries have found a way to move it up above 2.1.
Mm-hmm. And this attention to the data and the numbers, a lot of that probably ties back to your work in polling. How did you go from polling to this population question?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. I've always been fascinated by demography because there's certain realities that exist in terms of how a country's population is structured that have an effect on public opinion. So, if you've got a lot of young people and very few old people, well, you have one set of agenda issues. If you've got a lot of old people and you don't have very many young people, you have another set of agenda issues. So I've always been fascinated about how these things reinforce each other. But just like in a lot of economics and a lot of other type of social sciences, the projection was that these population changes were going to be taking place far in the future, or they're too slow for anybody to really take into account in terms of their day-to-day analysis. In political polling and other types of polling, I think we've been victims of the same thing. There's a lot of demographic information that we should include in the way that we look at public opinion to try to understand why it's breaking the way that it is.
So what demographic information is standing out to you that's influencing what you're seeing in polling?
I think the single biggest thing is population aging. So the population in most countries is a lot older than people assume. So in the United States, I think the median age is about 39. In Canada, where I am today, it's about 42. As I said before, in Japan, I think it's pushing up to 47, 48. So the fact that the population is so much older than a lot of the popular cultural analysis suggests. So we have an obsession with Gen Z and millennials. And it's like, oh, well, do you really understand that they're not actually that big? They're not actually that big in terms of population. And by the way, millennials are a lot older than we think they are. We tend to use the term millennial to mean everybody who's young. But, millennials are basically people who grew up in the 80s. Right, 80s and 90s. So you sit back and you say, those people are now in their 40s. The oldest millennials are in their 40s. So I think that, when we start talking about some of these demographic and generational trends and you start picking them apart a little bit, it's in some instances you find that there's not a lot of there in terms of popular conception. So like I said, the age of the population is not something that we take into account. So the idea that, for example, the futures, the current marketplace is all being defined by youth. Well, it's small and it doesn't have a lot of money. If you live in America, or if you live in Canada, or if you live in the UK, or if you live in France, or particularly if you live in a place like Italy, Spain, Japan.
Yes, and that gets to something that maybe people seem to miss out on with polling. I think we often think of it as being very much a politically driven question, but it seems that it can really influence marketing too. What trends in marketing are you seeing to address this population demographic question?
Oh, it's a battle, Brendan. Because you go in and sit in most marketing meetings and you'll hear a conversation about, what are we going to do to address the younger population? Because what we need to do is we need to get them young because they'll become, long-term loyal customers. And you sit back and you say, sounds like 1955 or 1960. I'll give you a great example of this. I did a presentation to a restaurant association about a year ago, maybe it was a couple of years ago. And, the CEO of the restaurant association got up on the stage and, turned around and took a selfie, as everybody does these days. Here's the audience behind me. And, it's all about that kind of stuff now. And, we're taking pictures of our food and it's an experience. And then she told a story. She said, the other day I was standing in my kitchen in my house, and my kids had some friends over and they were playing upstairs, and all of a sudden the doorbell rang, and one of the kids ran down and it was skip the dishes, and they grabbed a bag and they ran back upstairs, and then 15 minutes later another kid rushed downstairs, grabbed something from Uber Eats and ran back upstairs. This is the future of dining. And to which my answer was, well, why didn't they deliver anything to you? Because you've got all the money. So who's talking about you and the older population, how you might be using some of these things? Because the kids only get their money through their parents in many instances, and they're not the big spenders in the households. It's the parents. So, we have this obsession with youth and marketing that is misplaced given the current structure of the demography, particularly in places like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, which is an older population than we're assuming. And quite frankly, the baby boom is going to continue to define the marketplace going forward, because it simply continues to be the biggest segment of the population in most countries, most Western countries. It's not the same in other places.
Yeah. So Darrell, again, it seems we have a narrative and then we have an actual reality of population. What do you think makes the narrative that marketing needs to aim so young?
I just think it's a bias that has emerged from the start of consumer culture, which really started at the end of the Second World War, when we had the baby boom, and a lot of a huge cohort of young people were born, the largest in history in many countries in the West, and they all of a sudden started to have their own disposable income because we weren't living as much hand to mouth. We developed a fast growing middle class. Kids started to have their own money, and they started to spend on things that kids wanted, whether it was music, whether it was food, whether it was clothing. Well, all of these consumer products, which never really existed that much prior to the Second World War, all of a sudden these youth oriented products exploded. In terms of driving economic growth, and so we've continued on this same path to think that that's what our future is going to be, simply because that's what it was. So I think that what happens is it's a reflex. It's a muscle that hasn't been tested by reality of data in the advertising and marketing industry. That it's all about kids, and the truth is, there's not as many of them as we thought. There's fewer of them every day. And the average age of the population, particularly the consuming population with money, is older. So what are we doing for them? And the answer is not very much. In fact, they're invisible. When was the last time you saw an ad on television featuring a 65-year-old, 70-year-old woman who wanted to go out and eat? It's all about kids.
Right.
And it's like, well, there's going to be a youth segment. Absolutely. We're going to continue to have kids. But it's not as large a segment of the population as we think it is. And the reason that we don't, that older people are invisible in advertising in other places is we can't think about how to get them to dispose of the resources and assets that they have. We've ignored it. So I think one of the biggest challenges going forward for the marketing industry is how you free up some of this wealth, some of this assets, to maybe, for example, give people a better life experience when they're in their older ages, particularly when they're retired. I mean, 65 is not that old anymore. Yeah. The average American, although, as I said before, longevity has declined a little bit, the average American is moving, living up into their late 70s. Back in the 1920s, the average American probably lived into their mid-50s.
Oh, wow. Well, that's quite a difference. Darrell, another thing that you highlighted in the book, too, is that there are events that are starting to catch on, that are starting to specialize in the older crowd. And one that you highlighted was, you called it Old Cella.
So, I didn't call it that. The people who were working, I don't know if they called it that, but certainly people did call it Old Cella.
Yeah, so yeah. Old Cella is a contrast to Coachella, which I'm in Los Angeles, so I hear so much about Coachella, and it seems like it's the biggest thing. And then looking at the numbers, it seemed ticket prices were higher for Old Cella, that the amenities were much better, that it was a different kind of luxurious experience, and it's marketing to older folks. What are you seeing that is assessing this, or that is in this reality of population?
Well, actually, I wrote another book called Next, which is basically just about Canada, so probably not as much interested to your listeners, but in which I break it down even further and look at things like, okay, well, who makes money in the concert industry? Well, it's all legacy acts. Very, very few acts have emerged since the start of this millennium that can actually sustain a stadium tour. Most of the acts that can sustain stadium tours probably produced their most influential music prior to the year 2000. In fact, I go through and do a whole analysis of this. But yeah, that's one of the things that you're starting to see, is that concert promoters are starting to realize the people are, willing to pay a premium to see some of these legacy acts and pay for a really much better experience, like they did at Desert Trip, which was called Old Child. I don't know if they're still doing it, but it's funny. I was in Vegas doing this presentation that I do on aging population, and I used the example of Old Shell, and somebody stuck up their hand in the audience and said, "I was there." You're exactly right. What they basically did was they took that that festival concert experience, and they put it in an environment that older people with more money, who are prepared to pay a premium for the comfort of being able to participate in this without having to stand in for hours in line for warm beer, or not bathrooms that didn't work, and food that was just fast food or whatever. They really amped up all the amenities that were related to experiencing this type of a festival. In fact, with numbered seats, ticketed and numbered seats, rather than just mass entry and just generally standing in a field. And that was the most profitable concert. At least the year that we looked at it was the most profitable concert that had ever been done.
Wow.
Concert series.
Wow. What other products like that are due or are beginning to evolve?
I think at some point you're going to start seeing things like cars change. Automobiles. Okay, so the auto industry is obsessed these days with going to EVs, and we're glad they are. I mean, somebody's got to do something to help the climate. But how many of them are actually constructing things that constructing automobiles can fit mobility devices in them? Cities these days are obsessed with bike lanes. I mean, they're everywhere now. But, in a city in which the average person is, say, going to be the age of 50, who's riding a bike anywhere? I mean, they're certainly not commuting to work, even if they are going to work. Maybe we should be looking at this infrastructure as more of an alternate mobility mechanism. Maybe it's for e-scooters, maybe it's for e-bikes, maybe it's for those, bigger, mobility devices that people sit on in order to be able to get from place to place. I think there's going to be an interesting debate over that going forward. I mentioned restaurants before. Hey, how about turning down the music?
Yeah.
So I can actually have a conversation, and maybe turning up the lights a little bit so I can actually see the menu, and maybe making the seats that I go in and out of seats that I can push back and forward. So if I have a little harder time sitting down, I can actually sit down comfortably. And maybe she should have some place up near the front of the restaurant that if I've got a mobility device to get in or out, that I can leave it there. I mean, I think all of these sorts of things we're going to start having conversations about, and and up to everything, including technology, like the technology we're talking on today, for helping children of older living parents stay connected so they can do things like check their meds, make sure that that they're safe, checking in on them on a regular basis, and training older people to use technology like this to stay in touch with children who are living in different places who have an interest in making sure that their parents are well taken care of. There's going to be all sorts of conversations about these sorts of things, but they all seem very niche. I mean, we sort of giggle a little bit as we talk about them, but this is the future.
Yeah. So when your company is working with people and you're presenting this data, how do you help people to overcome their bias, their narratives that they have? How do you get them grounded in the data?
Well, we start there with the data. I mean, I think opinions are always interesting, but data settles the debate. And I usually start off with that Mark Twain quote, and also used in The Big Short by Michael Lewis, which is, "It's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble; it's what you know for sure that's wrong that does." Yeah. So basically, when I present on talk to various audiences about this topic, I just start with, okay, you think this. Here's actually what's going on. Here's the data. You don't have to listen to me. Just take a look. Here's what the data look like. Okay, now that I've shocked you into reality, let's have a conversation about what the future looks like. And I try to keep it very simple, but not simple in the sense that I play it down or anything like that, but keep it very straightforward and memorable. So fertility rates. That's the first thing I check whenever I go into any country, and I'm interested in talking to somebody who's, I don't know, wants to do political polling or wants to do research on the marketplace or whatever, one of the first things I look at is whether or not that country's having kids, and then the next thing I look at is how old the median population is. So the number that's halfway in between, half the population's older, half the population's younger. That's so much information, and almost nobody looks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I do. I just look.
Mm-hmm. What got you into this sort of business too? I don't know a lot of folks who went into polling. How did you move into this industry?
Yeah, how you fail into it. I was always fascinated by it. So I did my educational background's in political science. So I did a PhD in political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, and I was always interested in quantitative research. And the reason I was interested in it is not because I'm a person who's particularly mathematically adept, but I liked the way that it summarized a problem really quickly and got a lot of the opinions out of the conversation and got people to focus on facts. Mm-hmm. So there were demonstrable populations. I mean, the demonstrable propositions and everything that you looked at. You could propose a series of null hypotheses to try and test, just like CSI, right? You disprove the null hypotheses to find out what's actually closer to the truth. And I just found the fastest way to get there was with data. Mm-hmm. And the conversations were really short. Mm-hmm. And usually what I'd say to clients is, look, I'm going to show you the numbers. I mean, we all agreed on the questions we're going to ask. I'll show you the numbers, and if you don't agree with what I've come up with, then I'm probably wrong. Mm-hmm. But that's very few people end up taking me on or contradicting on that point, because the numbers really do settle the arguments. Mm-hmm. So that's what got me into it. I liked its precision, I liked its efficiency, and I liked how it forced people to focus on the facts.
Mm-hmm. Now, taking that information and looking ahead, something we're very excited about here in the States is the midterm elections, 2022. Mm-hmm. What do you think will be big factors in that?
Well, I think the first thing is that you can take a lot of the daily columns that are written in newspapers and people talking about the daily TikTok of the campaign and all that kind of thing. This is the most momentous thing ever, and this is going to be the biggest. Look, American elections have a certain structure. We know over time that after several elections, that midterm elections always work against the incumbent. Sometimes they don't, but almost always work against the incumbent. So Joe Biden and the Democrats, and it's the Democrats and rather than specifically Joe Biden, because he's not running, obviously, but the Democrats are moving into a period in which the off-year elections favor the Republicans. So, I start from that contextual reality is that this is an uphill battle for the Democrats to begin with. And then we take a look at other factors. So, for example, like approval level of the president. Well, that counts for probably 20 to 30% of the variance in terms of whether campaigns are successful or not. Another contextual variable. So how is Joe Biden and his presidency performing? The answer at the moment is not well. And I've read a few articles over the weekend in which they've said that his numbers have been improving and all that. We haven't seen it in our polling. I mean, I just got our most recent polling that we put out on presidential approval, which has Biden at 38. Donald Trump at his worst was, I think, around 38. So Joe Biden's got maybe there's some, environmental aspects that are changing around him. Maybe some of the mood is improving a little bit. Maybe people are going to give him a little bit of a look. But he's really going against these two big factors, which are this is not his part of the election cycle. And then the second part is that his approval level is really low. And it's going to be a drag on the Democrats for sure. So our expectation is that the Republicans are probably going to do pretty well in November. Mm-hmm. That the Democrats are going to suffer a bit in the elections, and the only question is really how badly. Are they going to lose both the House and the Senate, and if so, by how much?
Mm-hmm. When someone gets data like this, what do they then do to act on that information? Are they saying, okay, then maybe we have to move this metric in people's perception to then further our agenda, or how do they actually act on it?
Well, you're seeing Joe Biden do it over the space of the last week. So what he's decided is that he's tired of sitting back and allowing the environment to define the campaign. So people are really worried about inflation. They're still worried about COVID. They're worried about gas prices. They're worried about a whole series of things in the United States. They're worried about healthcare. So what he's decided to make this a referendum on MAGA Republicans. So to get a sharper edge, more partisan edge into the campaign, to energize his base, because that's what's there's not a lot of energy around Joe Biden. So to try and get some energy into the campaign, he's hoping that he can energize it by focusing on what he considers to be people who are enemies of democracy. So he's going to try and make this a question about that, an election about that fundamental question. The problem, of course, when you do that is when you energize your own base, you also energize the other guy's base. And the problem that he's running against is there probably is more energy on the other side. So this is one of those things that there's probably some modeling that shows that more energy in the campaign around partisan issues has the potential to build the Democrats, but is probably underestimating the effect that it's going to have on the Republicans. So it's a pretty risky strategy, I would say.
How do you navigate that? It seems that there is this question of the left energizing the right and vice versa, or even as we see more radical extremes that they seem to bring each other out. How does someone work with that?
Well, that's what Biden's trying to do. He's made the bet that, and his campaign advisors have made the bet that if they can put more energy into this election and they can make the election more meaningful than a midterm usually is, and particularly if they can push up turnout, because midterm elections usually have relatively modest turnout. If they can push up turnout on the left, particularly around issues, for example, like a woman's right to choose, and get more women to show up than normally would show up in a midterm election, that possibly they could surprise people on election day. So you can see that that's their strategy. That's what they're trying to execute, because prior to that, they were basically drifting into probably a pretty sound drubbing. But it looks like he wants to fight. It looks like he wants to fight on this basis. The question is whether or not, as I said before, when he pulls the pin on this grenade, whether he catches a whole bunch of shrapnel himself.
It's interesting that point about turnout too, and you said that the incumbent is often not favored in a midterm election. So would it be that maybe people who are on the other side you find are frustrated, and then they come out in response to the incumbent? Do you think that's a trigger?
Yeah, if they see it as potential to change things. So if you're on the right and you want to disrupt the ability of Joe Biden to get through his agenda, because he has, he's obviously suffering in the Senate right now, but he has the House, and he obviously has the bull pulpit of the president, the bully pulpit of the presidency. That if you could deprive him of, say, for example, the House, time to go, right? Or particularly if you could move the Senate in the other direction, that basically turns Joe Biden into a lame duck for the last 2 years of his presidency.
And we talked earlier about marketing to certain age groups, demographics, and things. What do you see with getting messages out politically? Are those more effectively targeted than what you're seeing with marketing of products and things?
Well, the thing about products compared to politicians is that they tend not to have the same type of immediate emotional energy in them as political choices do. So you don't get furious at your toothpaste. In politics, you can get furious at politicians. So it's a different type of emotional content. And with products, I mean, I guess election day is every day when you decide to buy something, but there's no definitive, big day when everybody's being forced to make one decision at one time about this particular topic, like you see in election campaigns. So I think that the emotional content around marketing of products and services is not nearly as intense as it is around politics, which makes it harder for marketers to cut through, by the way.
So how does that play out for those who are trying to influence politics? Do you think that they're more grounded in data because they realize the emotional significance?
Yeah, I think that data is a big part of politics. I think that really professional campaigns tend to be very data-driven. Mm-hmm. They understand public opinion because they do a ton of research. They understand it, which I think, in some places, in some jurisdictions, even in the United States, I see this. They forget how important geography is to what's going on. Like elections are won, congressional districts and Senate seats and governor's seats and that kind of thing in specific states. Mm-hmm. It's not like a national numbers really don't mean anything. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. That's what the disconnect was between outcome and research in the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. Like the 2016 election, which had Hillary Clinton winning by 2 points, the consensus polling, well, she did. She won by 2 points. Mm-hmm. But she lost the election. Why? We lost track of geography. Mm-hmm.
How are tools like very targeted ads through social media and things changing the landscape of this sort of influence in politics?
Well, they allow you to be a lot more narrow. I mean, you don't have to go out and buy a television ad and hope that you're going to hit, the 5% of your market that you're going to hit, even though you have to go out and spend, enough money to hit 30% of the market with social media advertising, because you know so much about the people who are on these media platforms. And it says an awful lot, I guess, about why people are so concerned about privacy. But you do know a lot about people who are on those platforms. You can push together some very targeted messages to segments of the population to try and motivate them to do what needs to be done in an election campaign or in a marketing campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Looking ahead to 2024, do you think that Donald Trump could make a comeback in the USA?
Well, the thing about Trump is nobody saw him winning in 2016. He lost by a fairly significant margin in the last election, and normally that would be enough to get rid of somebody. But he continues to persist. We know that he has a pretty strong following in the American population. There are people who really identify, maybe not necessarily. He's a symbol for that set of disaffections that exist in the United States on the right. There's no comparable option on the Republican side that has that same level of ability to mobilize people. So, I don't think you can count him out.
What would you say is that set of disaffections?
Well, I think a fair amount of it is about the idea that America is in a longer-term decline. And this decline is hitting a particular class of people in the United States. I don't necessarily buy into the hillbilly elegy view on this. It's not just about economics. It's also about, I think a lot of it is cultural change. Cultural change that's happening in the United States, in which a significant segment of the population feels that public institutions are not speaking for them anymore. Mm-hmm. And certain values are being promoted by the political class in the United States that rub people the wrong way. So there's that kind of reactionary element that exists around it, and this sense that there's a whole group of people who are better thans that are basically running the place, and they no longer represent what the average American wants. Now, you can say that that's complete hooey. You can say whatever you want, but it is a really motivating idea in American politics today, but not just in American politics, in a lot of global politics today too. Mm-hmm. This idea that there's this internationalist elite that, Washington elite, or in my country we call them the Laurentian elite, or other places we would call them, in France, the people who are around the better educated, higher class people who live in Paris, and how they treat everybody else that lives in the country. This sense that there's these out and these in, these out people and these in people, and that people like a Donald Trump represent the revenge of the outs. And that's really what you're seeing. Some of it is economic, but an awful lot of it is cultural.
Mm-hmm. How did someone who has his name on big towers in New York City and casinos and things ever present himself as the person to identify with as an outsider?
It's and this is one of the things that I get asked a lot, which is, so you take a look at people who are around Brexit, or you like to take people who are around, say, the Liberal Party in Australia, or you take a look at the Republicans, or actually not the Republicans, the more sort of the Marine Le Pen and more upper class business people that are around her in France. Like, how can they see themselves as being the downtrodden? How are they? How does Donald Trump see himself as being on the outs? Well, he's on the outs culturally, not economically. Like he's not seen as a person with sort of valid intellectual perspective that needs to be taken seriously. Seen as vulgar. And that's what it is. That is the animating part of this, which is people feeling that they get looked down upon by these people who are in government, or they're now in major corporations, and or they're cultural elites. The people who are on the right in the United States getting all upset about what Hollywood talks about, right? Or this is what it is. It's not just people feeling like they lost their jobs to China. Those are the arguments that I think people who are part of the enlightened class, that's the argument they want to have, right? That because it's an argument that both the polite right and the polite left can have. We can argue about whether taxes are too high or too low. We can argue about whether or not government services are all that they should be. We can argue about whether or not that we should spend more or less on defense. Those are polite conversations. These other conversations about cultural issues are much, much more tribal, and they're nastier. And the cultural and the political elite just doesn't want to deal with it, so they treat it as vulgar. And Donald Trump has tapped into that. But not just him. All of these populist leaders around the world. Bolsonaro now in Brazil, same thing. Same thing.
Going forward, do you see a trend toward more populism around the world? It feels that way, but in the numbers?
Yeah, we're in a populist supercycle when it comes to politics, no doubt. It's a political strategy that works, which is why people buy into it. And there's increasing divide between people who live in, expensive downtowns, liberal, well-educated, much more diverse in terms of cosmopolitan in their political views, their social views, how they look at the world, and then people who aren't part of that. And there's this fight that's taking place. And in the past, people that we would see as our better thans, we would defer to them. And what's happening now is we're not deferring anymore. We really feel that these people work on their own behalf, not on the behalf of the general population. And when I say we, I mean the people who are outside of it. You and I are as much part of this class as anybody, by the way.
Yeah.
That we're just doing this.
Right.
It's part of this.
Yeah. What does it look like when you layer these elements over the demographics that you've discovered through your work with Empty Planet?
One of the things that we've discovered is the key, I would say, geography in all of this these days. The real swing geography is suburban. So we look at major urban areas growing all over the world, but actually what's really growing dramatically is the suburbs. So the suburbs are the key from a demographic perspective. It's a geographic perspective. The key swing block in just about any place that you want to go to these days. So keep your eye on the suburbs anywhere that you go. Homeowners live in the suburbs. They tend to be older. So suburbanite, older people, maybe better educated, people who are older may have already raised their families or are raising their families. They're a key demographic in any I would say any future political scenario. And the downtowns really stand out in terms of being less of what I just described in most places.
What changes do you see in your industry in polling? Are there things that are evolving over time, or with technology, or things that are maybe more to people's tech than to asking someone face to face?
Well, still we do an awful lot of face to face research, especially for governments and than people who want, higher quality in terms of data collection.
Mm.
What's really changed, I would say, is that we have more ways of contacting people than we've ever had.
Mm.
So whenever people say, "Oh, well, you can't go out and survey people the way that you used to," well, that's true. We still do that, but we have so many other ways of contacting people these days, whether it's through social media, whether it's through accessing people in using different methodologies of getting that type of information. So we can contact them in so many more ways than we used to be able to. What's really hard to do is that single, precise, probabilistic sample, the one-time sample frame. Instead, what we're doing is we're having to cobble together insights on what's going on in the population based on different types of methodologies to contact different segments of the population and then modeling it out.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is modeling is becoming more of what we do. The other thing, the emphasis on speed as in any industry has gone way up. We don't have 3 weeks to do a political poll now. We want to know what the results are tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So things are moving very fast in terms of speed.
Mm-hmm.
But also, as I said before, technology has given us so many more ways of accessing information about people. And then after that, it's really about modeling and trying to get insight out of it. But at the end of it all, honestly, you can have as much data as you want, but unless you've got somebody who can go through it and kind of go,
yeah,
that's interesting. Empty planet. Right. Unless you've got somebody who can do that, that's still the same thing that has existed all through in this type of data-driven industry. The person who can who can create meaning out of numbers.
Mm-hmm. So, as people are becoming more aware of the depopulation issue, what do you think that these people who are in these offices, policymakers, can be doing to address the issue and the repercussions?
I think the first thing is to just wake up to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why John and I wrote Empty Planet. As I said before, it was that thing that that everybody knows for sure that happens to be wrong. Mm-hmm. So it's first getting people to wake up to the idea, and it's still a struggle
mm-hmm.
to have this conversation with people, because the first two things I usually hear back are, particularly when the book first came out, was you can't possibly be right.
Mm.
I don't get that as much anymore, because the data's been really been building since the book came out 3 years ago. But then the other thing that we get an awful lot of is, well, this is fantastic. This is great. Fewer people is going to be good for everything. And it's like, not so fast.
Mm-hmm.
Not so fast. This is a complex issue. A population that's rapidly aging and has a decreasing ability to reproduce itself is a very, very different population than the population of, I guess, 2 billion at the time of the Second World War. It's not all young. It's old.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of issues that are related to a smaller population, because it's a population that looks very different than the previous, smaller populations that we had. And that's a really tough conversation to have with people, because they don't think through that. So I remember the first public presentations we were doing. We did a book launch at a bookstore here in Toronto for National Geographic, and all the hands went up in the room, and it was like, oh, this is a good thing. And it's like, well, yeah, in some ways it is, but did you think that population that you're talking about, that's much smaller and better for the planet, is actually going to be old and much less capable of reproducing itself and declining every year? Did you think about that? It was like, oh no, I hadn't thought of that.
Right. So
the complexity and difficulty of managing all of this, I don't think people have really come to terms with. So yeah, the first thing I always get confronted with was you can't possibly be right. We're sort of over that now. And now the second thing is it's a more complicated issue than just celebrating the fact that the population is going to be smaller.
Mm-hmm. It's in your book that you were pointing out that Canada has done a lot with their immigration policy. What do you think we can learn from Canada?
Well, that's the thing to learn from Canada on all of this, is that basically our approach to dealing with declining population and aging population has been to really embrace immigration. We bring in about 1% of our population every year, and it continues to grow. But there are very, very few countries in the world that will be able to do this. because the political blowback can be extreme. So Canada, all the political parties are basically on the side of being pro-immigration, and we've crossed that Rubicon a long time ago. But most countries in the world have not, and the political ramifications of embracing more open immigration are very difficult. But in the short to medium term, it's really the only solution at scale that can help slow down the process of population aging.
Mm-hmm. What would be the case for that if someone was skeptical?
Well, I think that the biggest case is that first of all, that you just show them the aging of the population.
Mm-hmm.
We need more younger people. Mm-hmm. And by the way, unless your kids are going to have more kids, somebody's going to have to pay all these pensions. Mm-hmm. Somebody's going to have to be a consumer here. Mm-hmm. Somebody's going to have to produce the next generation. Mm-hmm. So maybe we need to consider immigration. But then the other part of this, and this is where it's incumbent upon politicians and public officials to get it right, which is that we need a well-structured, appropriate system for vetting immigrants. It's not just opening your doors and letting anybody in. That's where you start getting into trouble. It's the Canadian approach has really been more like recruiting than just responding to a demand for people to come to this country.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah, and a lot of people look at immigration as being what's happening on the southern border of the United States. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And the Canadian example shows that it can be different. Although we do have our issues with our immigration policies here. As I said before, there's no serious political party in the country that has potential for forming national government that is against immigration. They're all basically aligned from the left to the right. But we need to be serious about how you structure accepting people in as immigrants. Mm-hmm. What the vetting process is, and the Canadian government is relatively serious, not perfect, but relatively serious, and serious enough about it that it's been able to convince the Canadian public that it does a good job of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Outside of immigration, in your book, there are touches of other government initiatives that maybe didn't go so well. I wonder, what do you think individuals who are waking up to this depopulation issue could do to have a positive influence?
Well, if you want to have more kids, go ahead. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's the other thing I get at some public meetings. Somebody, will stand up and say, I've decided to not have any children because I care about the environment. It's okay. Well, personal choice, do whatever you want to do, but don't criticize the people who decide they want to have children, because guess what? If everybody makes the same decision as you, humanity doesn't exist in 100 years. Mm-hmm. We're a delicate species. Mm-hmm. If we don't reproduce ourselves, within 100 years, we're all gone. Mm-hmm. So who's going to do that? Mm-hmm. So I think that, the first thing is to recognize that having kids is a good thing, again, would probably be a change in perspective that we have to bring on board. I think that people who've gone down the road of not having kids as a result of their concerns about things like the climate or whatever, well-intentioned, there are other consequences to that, as I said before, if everybody adopted the same point of view, the impact on humanity would be catastrophic. So I think the first thing is, like I said, thinking about the positive aspects of having children again. And then the second part of that is, if we're thinking positively about having children, how do we make it possible for those who decide that they want to have kids to have an easier time to do it? Mm-hmm. So whether it's through childcare programs, whether it's through, workplace accommodations, whether it's through recognizing the contribution that women make in the household in some other way, maybe paying off in their careers or whatever, but creating an environment in which people don't feel that there's such a huge penalty to have kids, I think would be something that we can revisit.
Yeah, that seemed a theme through the book, was that there seemed to be a sense of a big cost, whether it be financial, career, education, or even in cultures with dowries, where there's a literal cost to getting married. All these things seem to be the issue tied together.
Well, and they are, because the cost of all of this means that what happens is family formation gets pushed way out. Mm-hmm. So, the average, I'll use Canada as an example because it's the one I know best, but it's fairly analogous to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So back in the 1950s, the average American woman probably got married around the age of 21. She probably had her first kid soon after. She probably had 3 plus during the course of her lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, I can give you the exact stats. The highest birth rate was back in 1959. The average Canadian woman got married around the age of 20, 21, and she had 4 kids in her lifetime. Now the average Canadian woman, if she gets married at all, gets married around the age of 30
mm-hmm.
and has 1 or 2 kids. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why our birth rate's 1.4, which, by the way, is the same as Japan.
Wow.
So without immigration, Canada's already in big trouble.
Mm-hmm. There is some discussion that maybe off of World War II, there was a crisis, and then people had this baby boom because there was sort of a relief. We seem to be going through a bit of a cultural crisis since 2008 with the financial issues, through COVID. You've looked at what is next in these sort of trends. What do you see for a possibility of a more optimistic rise in population?
I don't see any.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any. I think that basically what we've got to be doing is, instead of thinking that this is going to reverse itself on its own, is understanding that it very likely will not, that the peak of the population is going to come sooner, is going to come lower than anybody thought before, and that we need to start getting ready for it in all aspects of, however we run our societies, and we run our economies, because it's coming at us, and there's really nothing we can do to change it around. I mean, you can slow it down through things like immigration. You can maybe have more family positive policies in the workplace in terms of how we support families that want to have kids, but none of this is anywhere in the world really moved birth rates above 2.1. So, it's really just a question of getting ready for what's fairly inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Not fairly inevitable. I don't mean to qualify it. Inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Well, Darrell, before I ask my last question, where should people who want to learn more about this look for you online?
You can just plug in anywhere, on YouTube or whatever. I talk about Empty Planet a lot, but really I think the best thing would be to just pick up a copy of the book. Mm-hmm. It's a short read. You can read it in 5 hours. I promise you there's only one chart or graph. The big focus is not on numbers. It's basically about the stories of real people who are struggling with these issues and why this is happening on a global basis, and what the reasons are behind it. So I would encourage them to pick up a copy of the book. I don't think they'll be disappointed. I think it's not a heavy read, and as I said, it's really a story about people.
Yes, I agree, and we'll put links to that in the description for everybody who wants to check that out. And Darrell, my final question is: you mentioned individuals getting ready for what's ahead. What do you think people can be doing to prepare themselves?
Well, I think that's a pretty big question. I think governments have to start thinking about healthcare in a different way. Mm-hmm. We need to start thinking about long-term care, and we need to start thinking about seniors. There was just a report that came out in my country yesterday, or actually maybe it was today, saying by 2030 there's going to be 1 million people in our country with dementia. I mean, take that times 10 in the United States. If the population is 10 times larger, maybe a little bit younger, maybe it's pushed off a little bit, but say it's 10 million people with dementia, there's no cure. What are we going to be doing about that? What are we going to be doing about long-term care? What are we going to be doing about everything from the types of entertainment facilities we have through to the types of consumer products we're going to be offering for a population that's much older than we think it's going to be? What's going to happen to all of this wealth that everybody assumes is just going to be this huge wealth transfer if everybody's spending all that money on healthcare and maybe having that one last trip and they're not passing it down to their kids? What's going to happen to real estate? What's going to happen to cities and how they function? What's going to happen to the suburbs and how they function? What's going to happen to all of these things that are so important to what our future is going to be? The private sector aspects of this, the business aspects are huge. The government aspects are huge, But one of the things that we know overriding or overarching all of this is the consumption that drove our economy for forever since the Industrial Revolution, but more specifically since the end of the Second World War, is going to end. So what does that future look like? Well, that's a really interesting set of questions. And you and I are among a very exclusive small group of people who are actually talking about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Darrell, thank you for having the courage to tell people about this and to get the word out and to take the time to talk with me. I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.